So the New York Times has announced that it will launch subscriptions to its backlog of podcasts on Apple and Spotify. So the most recent episodes of any of their podcast shows will remain free, right? So, if you listen to it early enough, you're not going to have to pay anything. But eventually you'll enter the backlog and you'll have to pay a monthly or yearly subscription for that. The Hollywood Reporter notes that subscribers will get, not only will they be able to access the old shows, but they'll be able to get early access to certain shows that maybe, like a couple days before. I got a quote here from Ben Cotton, who's the head of subscription products for the New York Times. Here's their kind of explanation for this strategy. Quote, "We have a slate of really outstanding shows, and we have built out dedicated places for people who want to listen to them on our own platforms, either in our core news app or in our audio app. But we have millions of listeners who are listening to our shows exclusively on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. So we see it as kind of a natural next step to extend our business from an audio standpoint to bring it directly to where listeners are listening to our shows on these platforms. We think our audio journalism is worth paying for, just the same as everything else that our newsroom produces every day. And we want to sort of take a next step in that journey from a business standpoint," end quote. And that's a really interesting point, what he says here about, where does he say? "We think our audio journalism is worth paying for, just the same as everything else," right? This idea, and I always thought it was weird that, us as the consumers are getting all this free journalism through their podcasts that you kind of don't even need a New York Times subscription. And I don't have one. My mother has one, so I mooch off of her. And that's where I source, not all the stories, but it's good to have, articles about these topics from the New York Times. Because obviously it's the New York Times. But I think that kind of makes sense, if in a way, right? So the pricing structure is going to be either $6 a month, or if you do it yearly, it'll be $50 a year. Now, notably, you'll have full access if you already have a New York Times subscription. So if you're already paying for New York Times, you're not going to have to pay an additional thing on top of this, though they may eventually raise their rates because they're going to include more stuff. But at least as of right now, it's not like you have to also do this. Notably, though, there's no mention of other podcast platforms, right? So, for example, I don't use either Spotify or Apple for podcasting. I use Apple for music. But I actually use a platform, Pocket Casts, because I like the way you can create different filters. So that way I'm able to filter different kinds of shows. And because there's certain shows that are daily, and it's kind of like if I don't listen to it within like a day, it's kind of like old news at that point. And then there's other shows that it's like, if I listen to it within a week, it's okay. And then there's some shows where it's like, I'm going back a decade, right? It's like, it's not really time pertinent. So I'm wondering, am I still just be able to get everything for free on Pocket Casts, or will they just not be available on Pocket Casts anymore, or whatever your preferred podcasting platform is? So the reason why this story intrigued me is because podcasts have really blown up over the past decade, because I remember in the 2000s, especially the late 2000s, it was kind of niche, right? Podcasts were kind of this more niche thing. But figures like Joe Rogan at Spotify have obviously had a huge influence. Not just him, there's obviously a bunch of other huge podcasters, but he really is the one that I think helped make it such a big business that, like, okay, real money is now getting involved, right? And New York Times has really, particularly the New York Times has really focused on growing their podcast library. And they have a lot of really popular shows. So, of course, they have Serial, which is like that, exactly what it sounds like. It's about, I guess, like serial killer cases or whatever. They also have The Daily, which is a daily show that they do, hence the name. I also really love the Ezra Klein show, and that's who's pictured here. He's a columnist, opinion writer and editor at the New York Times. He has his talk show. He brings on different people. Really just insightful, smart guy, right? It's great because it's free, or at least it was free. Or at least, I guess it will be free as long as you listen to it within a week, right? And again, like I was saying, the podcasting is a wonderful complement, if not for some people a full-on substitute for the written journalism. Because, it gives people the chance to be informed, even if they don't have the time to read, right? Because it's easier. You might have time to listen to something while you're on the subway or you're driving, or maybe while you're working at work, you can listen, as opposed to like taking the time to read an article. It's not because people are dumb or lazy. It's just sometimes because of the nature of capitalism, we don't always have time. So we have to kind of multitask. So the idea here, at least the business strategy, is that this will hopefully allow a positive feedback loop that reinforces their podcasting ambitions. So got a quote here from Paula Schuchman. I don't know how to pronounce this. Szuchman. I'm gonna say Schuchman. Sorry. Paula, who's the Times, New York Times director of audio, says, "Quote: The goal is that it gives us more opportunities to invest in more journalism and more shows and podcasts. So that's all for the good. Our strategy is going to continue to tap into Times journalism. Our strategy is the more the subscription model works, the more we can invest in growing the portfolios." End quote. So the idea, I guess, is more money for the podcasts means they have more money to invest into the podcast, which will get more people subscribed, which will hopefully become this kind of snowball effect, right? I got some comments here. Keza21 said, "Not happy about it, but my understanding is that they get most of their revenue from sources other than the reporting, like New York Times games, etc. So I get it." So that was gonna be another thing. Is journalism needs all the help it can get, right? Because the profit motive of capitalism and the integrity ambitions of journalists and journalism don't always align. They don't always contradict one another, but they don't always align, and then it creates tensions of, well, if push comes to shove, which are we going to prioritize, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that this leads to fake stories or lying stories, but it could just shift your business strategy, and it leads to a prioritization of certain stories or certain ways to frame a story, right? So the biggest example of this is just cable news, right? Which is firmly, held by the balls of needing to make as much money as possible, right? So cable news compared to written news is way more about spectacle and way more about entertainment, right? So what's the solution for this, right? So we've had billionaires buying news outlets, like what Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post, which theoretically, okay, that's good because then it's, that's a huge influx of cash, but then it could potentially become a conflict of interest, right? If you have an op-ed writer, maybe they won't be as aggressive about criticizing Amazon or Jeff Bezos, right? So that's, possible solution, but it's not an ideal solution. So the best scenario is when the journalism is subsidized by other offerings, right? So like Keza21 said. So puzzles, recipes, and then podcasts had always kind of blurred the line, right? Because they're journalistic, but they would have sponsorships usually at the beginning or the middle or the end. And now there's going to be paywalls. And again, the revenue from these ventures, as well as the subscription for the actual written journalism, it helps kind of subsidize the journalism is like a public good, right? And it needs to be subsidized by all of these very superficial products, because in a perfect world, journalism is not a product. So while I'm always, displeased, kind of like Keza said, while I'm always displeased that something that was once free is now going to be behind a paywall, in the long term, if it's going to help maintain journalism, then I'm cautiously for it. Viviana writes here, "I find it interesting that it's for the archive and not the newer episodes." Interesting, yeah, because you could do it where it's like only the new stuff you have to pay for, but then once it's old enough, you can go back. I would imagine the idea is because they do have those sponsorships, so they want as many people to listen as possible, I guess, to get as many people. And then if you get really into a show, you might want to go back. Because certain shows like The Daily are not like daily news recaps, like it just happens to release daily. But something like the Ezra Klein show, well, I guess these shows aren't super time specific. Like Ezra Klein might be talking to someone because of something going on at the time, but usually the conversations are just so interesting that you could just go back 3 years later and listen to it. Viviana also writes, "Do you think this will affect any university database access for students? Like, because it's now behind a paywall, it'll be something that colleges actively want to give their students to use?" That's a really good question. I would imagine yes, because again, at least the way it's going to be for now, if you already have a Times subscription, you'll be able to access all this stuff. So, and I imagine most universities already have that, or something like that. So, they would provide a subscription to the written New York Times before the podcast. So theoretically, if they're already investing in a subscription for the written journalism, then I'm sure they would provide that for the audio. Viviana also writes, "Like making audio journalism use more desirable in academics. Yeah, again, and this is a great kind of little bookend here, because podcasting, again, is not just grown commercially, but again, Ezra Klein is not just a writer. I mean, he started as a blogger. He's, I believe, one of the co-founders of Vox, left to go work at the New York Times. But some would argue, some have argued already, Ezra Klein is one of the major, not the reason, but a non-insignificant reason Joe Biden dropped out of the race. Because he was one of the few people, kind of part of the establishment, kind of Democrat, who, I think it was like in the spring, like March or April or May, he wrote an op-ed basically saying like Biden should drop out, that this is not going to work. And he got a lot of flack for it. And ultimately he was vindicated, right? So there's this sense that podcasting is not just becoming commercially important, but there's some really important journalistic work going on here. So I think as that continues to be reinforced, you're going to see a lot more podcasts be part of academic use. That you're going to start seeing people quoting podcasts in like doctoral papers, right? Like, because again, ultimately it's going to be, it's just another platform, right? Every medium is always kind of infantilized, until the people that grew up with it are now adults. And now it becomes a legitimate source of news and information. Keza also wrote, he really did speak up. I was surprised he started the domino effect, essentially. 100%. It was very slow at first, but it was kind of exponential. And again, his main kind of arguments were the Democratic Party, we've consolidated around Joe Biden. This is not going to work electorally. And I think his whole thesis was like, I think he is up to the task of being president. I just don't think he's up to the task of campaigning. So again, this is a podcaster, essentially a blogger turned podcaster, is having this huge influence, right? In case of 21 also writes, then the Pod Save guys jumped behind him, which was even more surprising. Yeah, the Pod Save guys, interesting group. But again, he really did start this domino effect. That's a great point. That Pod Save America being basically a political podcast hosted by essentially a bunch of like ex-Obama staffers, right? And eventually, yeah, it's once Pod Save America is saying this stuff, that's when it's really really kind of crossed a certain threshold of no going back. And Viviana, also, thank you very much for bringing this up. Remember, you did a story about George Clooney's op-ed. Yes, so I did do a story about George Clooney's op-ed about Joe Biden, right? So, but notably, he's a huge star. You expect him to have some kind of influence, right? And that was also hugely influential. So, but Ezra Klein started the process, right? So you don't get to George Clooney doing that, I think, without Ezra Klein kind of being one of the first people to go, the emperor has no clothes. So podcasting is really becoming important. And it'll be interesting to see if people pay for this. Wow, what an interesting story. I'm sure you have some thoughts about the topic, so comment below, let me know what you think. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really, really helps people find the channel and makes me feel all warm inside. Until next time, I'm Peter Mancuso. Peace out.